About a century and a half after the publication of Meleager's Stephanos, Philip of Thessaloniki set out to pick a new harvest of epigrammatic flowers that had blossomed in the meantime, weaving them together with his poems into a garland of his own. As Philip asserts in the proem to his collection, whose vegetal imagery echoes that of his predecessor, he plaited his garland in rivalry with or response to the Meleagrian Stephanos, and that is number 1 on the handout. I highlight in particular ant aneplexa tois Meleagreis hos ikelon Stephanois. While this explicit mention of his poetic model clearly announces that Philip will emulate, not slavishly imitate, Meleager's oeuvre, his words served only to confirm the negative view of modern critics, who were quick to dismiss Philip as a perpetuus imitator Meleagri, thus passive and weigernd, a second-rate dealer in second-hand materials, thus Gaupage. As Griffiths trenchantly judged in his 1970 review of Gaupage's edition, quote, when they, meaning the Garland authors, are bad, as Philip and Bassus consistently are, they are awful. And indeed, the overall scarcity of publications on Philip's Garland suggests that scholars have to a large extent not deemed it worthy of a closer look. Ironically, Philip's statement about the likeness of his own work to that of his predecessor also contributed to a widespread and long-lasting misconception regarding the arrangement of Meleager's Stephanos. The Palatine lemmatist J characterized the ordering of the latter collection as katastoicheion, meaning alphabetical according to the initial letter of each poem, even though not the slightest trace of such an ordering is to be found in the Meleagrian sections of the Palatine anthology. Numerous scholars continued to believe in the accuracy of this testimony by way of a curious logical leap. For, contrary to the Meleagrian passages, the Philippan sequences are manifestly organized by alphabet. And since Philip himself says that he imitated Meleager, this was taken as proof for the original alphabetization of Meleager's Garland. I just draw your attention to number 2 on the handout, where I have reproduced Lensinger's reconstruction of the anthology's arrangement with the Philippan and Meleagrian sequences that we can identify. To be sure, already Reitzenstein in 1893 refuted the lemmatist's claim, and Radinger in 1895 showed that Meleager ordered the poems on the basis of 2 principles that do not involve alphabetization. At the same time, however, these 2 scholars had, it seems, little appreciation for Philip's technique, which Reitzenstein characterizes as coarse or unrefined. He calls it plump, while Radinger implicitly dismisses it as insipid and unimaginative when he praises Meleager's evidently more sophisticated ensemble as follows. Translated that from the German, I never thought the witty and imaginative poet Meleager capable of having chosen such an unwitty and unimaginative arrangement for the Stephanos. Rather, I believe that a considerable part of the collection's charm lay precisely in the poem's refined and varied grouping. Alan Cameron was the first to have plausibly argued that Meleager divided his Stephanos into 4 books containing respectively erotica, epitymbia, anathematica, and epideictica. Building up on his observations, Catherine Gutzwiller brilliantly explored the intricate artistic design of Meleager's anthology. So far, however, no comparable study of Philip's Garland exists. Is this because Philip truly was a second-rate imitator who miserably failed to match the subtlety of his model? Or is it because the vestiges of his Garland in the Palatine anthology do not allow us to draw significant conclusions about its original layout? As we will see, getting a sense of Philip's arrangement is indeed fraught with more difficulty, precisely because of its alphabetization. However, as I hope to show in today's paper, there is much more to be said about Philip's editorial technique and his poetics of editing than has so far been done. Cameron very importantly recognized that Philip did not present the epigrams in a purely mechanical manner. He rightly observes that, quote, the grouping of poems by initial letter was merely a preliminary, the external framework of his system, and goes on to make some very interesting observations about thematic links within specific sections, without, however, offering a systematic study of the whole. Within the confines of this paper, I will not be able to give a comprehensive overview either, which I'm currently undertaking in a larger study. What I would like to do today is to present some preliminary remarks on the artfulness of Philip's design, illustrated on the basis of select examples, and to reflect on the various forms of concatenation, both within individual sections and throughout the anthology. While an alphabetical ordering in and of itself may strike us as rather technical and potentially tedious, it does not preclude additional and subtler modes of arrangement. The alphabet just provides, to use Cameron's words, an external framework within which Philip was free to connect poems through verbal and thematic links, just as Meleager had done. By opting for this kind of organization, Philip in fact imposed a greater challenge on himself, as he could only group together poems with the same, or possibly subsequent, initial letters, which considerably limited his choices for the creation of thematic subgroups. Meaningful juxtapositions were of course easily achieved when Philip wrote his own variations on poems selected for inclusion in the Garland. As Wivstrand noted already in 1926, there are several instances in which Philip begins an epigram with the same letter as its model so as to be able to juxtapose the two. Wivstrand's observation inspired Erhard Hirsch to analyze the Flechtweise, or Philip's art of interweaving, in a fascinating article of 1966, which however remained largely unnoticed due to its obscure venue of publication in the East German Wissenschaftliche Zeitschrift der Universität Halle. Hirsch, in fact, anticipates many of the conclusions independently reached by Cameron. While he may have gone a bit too far in his attempt to partially reconstruct Philip's collection, Hirsch certainly showed a much greater understanding of and appreciation for its design than previous scholars. Before presenting my own thoughts on the subject, let me briefly recapitulate the difficulties faced by anyone who wishes to examine the Garland's layout. We do, after all, not have immediate access to Meleager's and Philip Stephanos, but are dealing with various remnants that made it into the Palatine Anthology through a process of multiple anthologization. These remnants are significant enough for us to get a sense of the original design, but they do not permit a full-scale reconstruction of either collection. The sequences that go back to Meleager have basically been left unaltered, with the exception of the erotica. It is important to note that Cephalus may have skipped over individual poems, but he did not rearrange the texts. Since Meleager's Stephanos was divided into 4 parts, each devoted to another epigrammatic category, it was easy for Cephalus to insert whole sequences from this collection into his own books. Philip's Garland, by way of contrast, constitutes a rather different case. As Hirsch and Cameron have conclusively demonstrated, his collection did not encompass several thematically different books, each organized by alphabet, but epigrams of all types were intermingled in one continuous alphabetical series. It is likely that the series spanned several book rolls, but for our purposes the main thing to keep in mind is that the alphabet ran across any potential book divisions. As with Meleager's Garland, Cephalus excerpted epigrams from Philip's collection in a linear manner, that is, without rearranging them, but, and this is a crucial difference, he had to distribute the texts among his various books, according to their subject matter. This unfortunately means that none of the Philippian sequences found in the Palatine Anthology entirely preserves its original state. An epigram starting with alpha, let's say, that today appears in Book 5, may thus have stood next to an alpha epigram now in Book 6, 7, or 9, and so on. If Philip had arranged the texts in fully alphabetized order, so by each letter in each word, we could easily take the epigrams from the current positions in various parts of the Palatine Anthology and restore their original sequence. But such a strictly technical procedure would hardly have allowed for the creation of artful ensembles. By limiting the alphabetization to the first letter only, Philip was free to combine epigrams within given letter groups in any way he wanted. What then were the principles of Philip's arrangement? What kind of interwoven patterns would the ancient reader have encountered in a linear perusal of the Garland? Gow and Page attempted to envision Philip's modus operandi in excerpting and organizing the epigrams, but were left completely puzzled by the evidence and concluded, quote, "The confusion on his table and in his mind can be imagined. What we cannot imagine is a plausible reason for adopting such a procedure." But is it truly so hard to see some method in what they took for madness? However Philip went about collecting and sorting his material, the end result was, I submit, anything but random. Even if we are not able to fully reconstruct the original design, it is still possible to perceive thematic subgroups both within and across current alphabetical sequences. That is to say, not only are there clear signs of patterning among poems adjacent to each other, but following the groundbreaking discoveries of Hirsch and Cameron, we can also plausibly speculate about links between poems that now stand in different books or different parts of the same book. Overall, we may distinguish between several modes of concatenation on a micro and macro textual level, and I have listed those under number 3 on the handout. So first, there's a juxtaposition of model and copy. Secondly, we find collocation of poems that are thematically, structurally, or verbally linked without being direct variations of one another. Thirdly, subtler modes of interweaving through, for example, intertextual connections. Fourth, pairs or series of poems on the same theme distributed across the entire collection. And 5, the occurrence of specific key themes within individual letter groups. I am proposing these 5 categories as an analytical tool which may help us in describing Philip's art of interweaving, though they should not be taken as strictly separate entities. One and the same poem may very well be connected with other texts in a variety of ways. Let us now turn to some concrete examples, beginning with the most obvious type of concatenation, the combination of copy and model. In several instances, Philip took advantage of the fact that variations on a theme by 2 different authors happen to start with the same letter, such as, and now under number 4, you see Antipater's and Alpheus' epitaphs on Themistocles, both starting with Omicron, or Bianor's and Antipholus' epigrams on a fisherman catching an octopus that hurled into the air lands on and thus catches a rabbit. Though the 2 poems now appear in 2 different parts of Book 9, you see one is 9:14 and one is 9:2:27, it is a fair guess that they once stood next to each other. By juxtaposing such variations, Philip makes the poem's intertextuality tangible on the written page. Indeed, the physical collocation may serve to highlight intertextual subtleties already inherent in the epigrams, or have intriguing effects of its own. Such is the case, for example, with a pair of poems by Apollonides and Antiphanes on a spring that ran dry after being polluted by murder, and that is number 5 on the handout, AP 9, 257 and 258. While Apollonides' epigram starts with the name of the spring known as pure Catharé, and then recounts in a linear manner the events leading up to its disappearance, Antiphanes' variation begins with its present state, which logically follows from the previous description. As we learn from the first poem, the spring has turned around its waters and does not gush forth any longer, lines 5 and 6. Consequently, it is now, I quote from the second poem, line 2, devoid of water up to the last drop. Mortified by its pollution, the spring poignantly asks at the end of Apollonides' epigram, "Who will still call me Catharé?" It is hence no coincidence that Antiphanes does not give its name, but characterizes the spring as he paros oihutroi silibatsomene prochoaisi, she who once poured forth from well-watered mouths. With the water's disappearance, it seems the spring's name has been washed away as well, though we may perceive a faint echo of it in the poem's punchline, which transforms the incipit of Apollonides' epigram, he Catharé, into the acoustically similar expression, uk es aré. That's at the end of the second poem, so uk es aré sounding like u Catharé, she's not pure any longer. On the surface, he paros refers to the spring's former condition, but we may, I submit, also understand it on a metapoetic level as pointing to the spring of the previous poem, which served as model for Antiphanes' variation. By juxtaposing the 2 epigrams in his Garland, Philip adds further point to this meta-poetic meaning. Within his anthology, Apollonides' spring precedes that of Antiphanes, not just temporally, by virtue of being its archetype, but also physically through the poem's spatial arrangement on the written page. We may observe a similar meta-poetic game in a pair of epigrams on the suicide of a Roman soldier suffering from an incurable disease, 7-233 and 334. That is number 6 on the handout. The original once again comes from Apollonides, while the imitating text is a product of Philip's own muse. As mentioned above, Philip started many of his variations with the same letter as their models. In this case, the two epigrams begin not just with the same letter, alpha, but with the same word, the soldier's name, Ilias. And actually, there's a misprint here on the handout. It must be 234, not 334, excuse. Okay. Philip offers a close variation of Apollonides' text, keeping its tripartite structure. First 2 lines introduce the main character, then we have the juxtaposition of terminal disease vis-a-vis past courage, and then his suicide and last words, while substituting many of Apollonides' expressions with synonyms. Most intriguingly, Philip has Ilias, quote, look back in his mind on the former testimony, proteren martyrien, of his manly acts, line 3 and 4, which stands in stark contrast to the prospect of succumbing to a deadly disease. Ilias' recollection of his past bravery serves, I suggest, as a metapoetic cue pointing to the soldier's previous demonstration of courage through suicide in Apollonides' epigram, and once again the intertextual connection is highlighted through the poem's physical proximity. Let us now turn to the second type of concatenation, the interweaving of poems through thematic, structural, or verbal links. A fascinating example is provided by AP 9, 222 and 223, 2 epigrams that at first sight do not seem to have much in common. Number 7 on the handout. The one, a poem by Antipholus of Byzantium starting with Anera, is an epitaph for a dolphin which died on land after carrying a dead man ashore. The other, an epigram by Bianor starting with Angelien, tells of how a Cretan shot an eagle which subsequently fell from the sky and killed him with his own arrow. Though seemingly unrelated, the 2 poems appear like mirror images of one another, if read together, as the first is concerned with a dead human causing the death of an animal, while the second is about a dead animal killing a human. I do not believe that either author had the other's text in mind, but Philip invites us to perceive a thematic connection. Note too how one epigram evokes a transition from sea to land, while the other records a transition from air to land. Significantly, the 2 poems are part of a series in which animals feature prominently. Number 8 on the handout. We have 9-17 by Musio Scaevola, which addresses 2 frolicking goats, and is verbally linked with 2-19, which, though concerned with the return of Tiberius Claudius Nero to Rome, starts with the word aigibotu, goat feeding. 9-21 by Marcus Argentarius on a gem encarved with the image of Eros steering a lion chariot precedes our pair of poems, which in turn is followed by Crinager's epigram about a goat accompanying Augustus on a ship, 9-24. This epigram intriguingly unites the 2 themes of 217 and 219, goats and emperor, and is linked through its evocation of Zeus, Aigiochos, with the preceding text by Bianor, which presents an eagle as Zeus's message bearer. The eagle's fall from sky to earth is moreover reversed in the goat's wished-for catasterism on the model of Zeus' wet nurse Amalthea. The next poem by Honestus, 225, recalls how the spring Pegasus was created by horses' hooves, while 226 by Diodorus Zonas is an address to bees. Last but not least, Bianor's poem on the fisherman catching an octopus, 227, which was presumably juxtaposed with Antipholus' epigram on the same topic, picks up the 3 elements that link our epigram pair. The octopus is caught in the sea, hurled into the air, and falls on a rabbit sleeping on land, just as the eagle of 9-23 had dropped on the Cretan hunter. What is more, this double catch, consisting of prey from both sea and land, recalls the dichotomy of land and sea creatures that stands at the center of the dolphin's epitaph in 9-22. There can be no doubt that the poems of this series interact in a variety of ways. To make things even more complex, Philip also composed a variation on Biano's eagle poem, starting with a different letter. It starts with Io to pass, and hence belonging to a different section of the anthology. Hirsch speculated that variations by Philip whose initials do not correspond to those of their models were written before he developed the idea of putting together an alphabetically organized anthology. I do not think so. If juxtaposition were his only aim, it would have been easy for Philip to rewrite the beginning of his own poem for inclusion in the same section as its model. Instead, he chose to also create links across sections by positioning original and copy in separate parts of the Garland, or by distributing poems on the same theme across the collection. Thus we encounter, for instance, epigrams on Myron's cow among alpha, beta, and eta texts, while the cynic Diogenes can be seen wandering through the first part of the collection, making his appearance in the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and eta section. Another theme that spans the anthology is that of three brothers, dedicating 3 types of hunting nets to Pan, all variations on an epigram by Leonidas of Tarentum, in the alpha, delta, sigma, and tau section. It is very tempting to view these nets, whose triple dedication is reenacted several times towards the beginning and end of the anthology, as nodal points within the network of interwoven poems that together constitute the Garland. Within the confines of today's paper, I cannot delve more deeply into these macrotextual connections, but they do strike me as an integral element of Philip's technique. Let me also mention in passing a further structural device that deserves closer scrutiny: the accumulation of poems on certain key themes within individual sections. Can it, for instance, be a coincidence that we find a whole series of epigrams on dead poets, as well as poems concerned with wine and poetic inspiration in the first sequence, the alpha? These texts, in all likelihood, served a programmatic function within Philip's arrangement, similar to the epigrams on wine, song, garlands, and charis that opened Meleager's book of Erotica, as brilliantly demonstrated by Catherine Gutzwiller. Again, I must refrain from a more detailed discussion for the time being. As my final example for today's paper, I would like to present a pair of texts that are linked by what I consider the most sophisticated type of concatenation, one that is not immediately visible, but requires an intertextually alert reader to perceive. What I have in mind is a possible connection, and that's now number 9 on the handout, between AP 7627, an epigram by Diodorus, which starts with Hemitele, on a young man named Hipparchus who died shortly before marriage, and 7385, a poem by Philip starting with Heros, on the tomb of Protesilaos, whose surrounding trees shed their leaves as soon as they grow high enough to view Troy. Philip's text is a variation of an epigram by Antipholus, 7141, with the incipit Thessale, so starting with theta, not eta. As both Cameron and Hirsch observed, it is very likely that this pair of epigrams on Protesilaos created a bridge from one section to the next. Located within one of the main alphabetical sequences, 7385 is followed by only one eta poem, and it is a fair guess that Antipholus' Protesilaos poem, which now appears out of sequence, once opened the subsequent section or stood towards its beginning. Protesilaos, whose leap from a Greek ship to the shore signaled the beginning of the Trojan War, might have seemed like a particularly appropriate choice for this kind of textual boundary crossing. Diodorus' epitaph on Hipparchus forms part of the second alphabetical sequence in Book 7, where it precedes 4 additional eta epigrams. On the basis of its transmission, it is impossible to tell where exactly Diodorus' poem stood in relation to Philip's Protesilaos epigram. Nonetheless, I would like to suggest that Philip invited his readers to perceive a link between the two poems. Both Hipparchus and Protesilaos die young, leaving behind a grieving bride. The parallel in their fate alone would not suffice to posit a deliberate connection, but the incipit of Diodorus' epigram, Hemithele Thalamon, firmly establishes Hipparchus as a second Protesilaos by alluding to the famous Homeric expression Domos Hemiteles, which Protesilaos is said to have left behind together with a wife tearing both her cheeks in grief at Iliad 2:700, number 10 on the handout. The precise meaning of the adjective hemiteles was disputed already in antiquity. One explanation saw it as a reference to the fact that Protesilaos died childless. According to another, it denoted the bereft state of his household, while yet another viewed it as signifying that the marriage had not been properly completed. That the idea of a half-complete house is inextricably linked with the myth of Protesilaos is moreover suggested by evocations of the Homeric line in both Lucian's Dialogues of the Dead, number 11 on the handout, where Protesilaos explains to Iacchus that he died because of Helen and left behind his half-complete house, and Philostratus' Heroicus, where the hero takes issue with precisely these lines in Homer. An ancient reader encountering Diodorus' epigram for the first time would thus surely think of Protesilaos upon reading its initial distich, Hemi tele thalamon, and so on. I believe it very likely that Philip picked up on this allusion and inscribed himself in the intertextual game by positioning his own epigram on Protesilaos somewhere in the proximity of Diodorus' poem. To be sure, my argument must to a certain degree remain speculative, but we have good reason for assuming that Philip created such a connection. It would certainly be in line with his editorial practice, which was, I believe, much more sophisticated than most critics have given him credit for. I hope to have given you a first impression of Philip's arrangement and of the challenges that face anyone wishing to examine the ensemble in more detail. While it is impossible to fully reconstruct the Garland, we can still determine clear traces of patterning and with reasonable caution ponder links not visible at first sight. Did Philip succeed in weaving a Garland that can rival Meleager's? I would certainly say so. Thank you.